The chamber was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, as though the air itself is waiting. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing at the podium, her voice steady, her words deliberate. Representative Jasmine Crockett had barely begun to weave her argument when it happened. "Counsel, I'll stop you right there," Justice Brown Jackson interjected, her tone sharp, cutting through Crockett's sentence like a blade. The interruption landed with a jolt. Crockett's lips froze mid-word, her thoughts suspended in the air, unfinished. A ripple of gasps moved across the gallery, a collective intake of breath that seemed to echo against the marble walls. For a moment, Crockett's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with the unmistakable fire of someone who has been silenced before and refuses to stay silent again. She adjusted the microphone, her posture unbroken, her gaze steady. The audience leaned forward, sensing the tension, sensing the imbalance of power on display. This was not just a courtroom exchange. It was a collision of worlds, authority versus defiance, hierarchy versus resilience. Justice Jackson's interruption was more than a procedural cut-in. It was a challenge, a test, a reminder of who held the gavel. But Crockett's presence radiated something different, an unspoken promise that she would not be diminished. Not here, not now. The silence that followed was electric. Every second stretched, every heartbeat amplified. Crockett inhaled, ready to continue. But the weight of that first interruption lingered in the air, a shadow over the chamber. The audience could feel it. This was not the last time her words would be cut short. And yet, beneath the surface, there was something else, a quiet determination. A sense that Crockett was not merely enduring these interruptions, but preparing for something greater. Each pause, each dismissal, each attempt to silence her would only sharpen the edge of what was coming. The gallery whispered, the justices shifted, and the nation, watching through cameras and headlines, leaned closer. This was only the beginning. 7 interruptions would follow, each one more brazen than the last. But it was the 8th point, the one Crockett had been holding like a hidden blade, that would leave the court gasping in disbelief. No one in that chamber could have predicted what her final words would unleash. The case before the court was no ordinary dispute. It was a battle over the very machinery of democracy, a challenge to laws that would decide who could vote, whose voices would count, and whose would be pushed to the margins. The chamber was not just filled with lawyers and clerks. It was filled with history, with the weight of generations who had fought, marched, and bled for the right to be heard. Every word spoken in that room carried the gravity of millions of unheard voices waiting outside its marble walls. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood as more than a participant. She was a vessel for those voices, a living reminder that democracy is not an abstract principle, but a lived reality for communities who know what it means to be silenced. Her presence in that chamber was itself a statement, that the people most affected by these laws would not be erased from the conversation. She carried with her the cadence of neighborhoods where ballots are more than paper. They are lifelines, shields against invisibility. Across from her sat Justice Brown Jackson, cloaked in the authority of the bench. She was not merely a jurist in this dramatization. She was the embodiment of institutional power, the voice that could cut off another mid-sentence, the gavel that could decide who spoke and who did not. In that moment, she represented the cold machinery of authority, the system that too often tells the marginalized to wait their turn, to lower their voices, to accept the rules as written. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not just Crockett versus Jackson. It was democracy versus suppression, voice versus silence, the eternal struggle between those who demand to be heard and those who insist on controlling the conversation. Each interruption was more than a procedural move. It was a symbolic act, a reminder of how easily power can drown out truth. And yet, Crockett's resolve did not waver. Each time she was cut off, she steadied herself, her eyes flashing with the quiet defiance of someone who had been underestimated before. She knew the weight of the moment. She knew that millions watching from afar were measuring her composure, her persistence, her refusal to be erased. Every pause, every breath, every attempt to continue was a message. I will not be silenced. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with tension. Observers shifted in their seats, sensing that this was more than a legal argument. It was a moral confrontation. The cameras captured every flicker of expression, every tightening of the jaw, every glance exchanged between justices. Outside, the nation waited, headlines already drafting themselves in the minds of journalists. Will Crockett's voice break through? This was the crucible of democracy, distilled into a single exchange. Crockett was not just defending a case, she was defending the principle that every citizen's voice matters, that no amount of interruption can erase the truth. And though the interruptions would continue, Though the imbalance of power seemed insurmountable, there was a sense, subtle but undeniable, that Crockett was building towards something. Her persistence was not accidental. It was strategy. It was resilience. It was the lived experience of someone who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. Each interruption was fuel, each dismissal a spark. She was waiting, holding, preparing for the moment when her words would cut through the noise and leave the chamber stunned. But as the interruptions piled up, the tension reached a breaking point. To understand the drama unfolding in that chamber, one must first understand the figure who wielded the interruptions like weapons. Justice Brown Jackson, cloaked in the solemn black robe of the court, carried with her not only the authority of the bench, but the aura of someone who had long been accustomed to commanding the room. Her reputation preceded her: sharp questioning, relentless cross-examination, and a style that left even seasoned attorneys scrambling to recover. In the eyes of many, she was a force of intellect and precision. But in this moment, dramatized for the nation's gaze, she became something else entirely. The embodiment of authority turned against voice, the villain in a story where silence was the ultimate weapon. Her power was not just in the words she spoke, but in the timing of them. She had mastered the art of interruption, cutting in at the exact moment when momentum was building, when a speaker's rhythm was about to crest into persuasion. To be interrupted once was jarring. To be interrupted repeatedly was destabilizing. And that was precisely the effect. Each time Crockett began to build her argument, Jackson's voice sliced through, halting the flow, forcing Crockett to reset, to gather herself, to start again. It was a tactic as old as power itself. Disrupt the rhythm, and you disrupt the message. Observers in the gallery could feel the imbalance. On one side, a justice with the gavel, the robe, the institutional weight of the court. On the other hand, a representative carrying the voices of her constituents, armed only with her words. The contrast was stark, almost theatrical. Jackson's tone carried the clipped certainty of someone who knew she could not be challenged in that space. Crockett's tone carried the strain of someone who knew she must not falter, even as the ground shifted beneath her. The interruptions were not shouted or emotional. They were calm, precise, and delivered with the authority of someone who believed her voice was the final word. That calmness made them sting even more. It was not anger, it was dismissal. It was the quiet arrogance of power that did not need to raise its voice to dominate. Each interjection was a reminder: I decide when you speak. I decide when you stop. For Crockett, the effect was visible. Her eyes flickered with frustration. Her pauses grew longer, her breaths deeper. She was rattled, yes, but not broken. Still, the imbalance was undeniable. The chamber tilted toward Jackson, her interruptions echoing like gavel strikes, each one reinforcing the hierarchy of who mattered more in that room. And yet, beneath the surface, there was something more insidious. Jackson's interruptions were not only about control in that moment, they were about shaping perception. Every camera angle, every headline, every clip that would later circulate on social media would carry the image of Crockett being cut off, silenced, diminished. It was a performance of authority as much as it was an exercise of it. The villainy lay not in the legality of the act, but in the symbolism. The powerful silencing the persistent, the institution overshadowing the individual. The audience felt it. The whispers in the gallery were not just about the case, but about the spectacle. People shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what they were witnessing was bigger than legal argument. It was a metaphor for the struggle playing out across the nation. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? Who holds the power to decide when a voice matters? Jackson's reputation for sharp questioning had always been framed as brilliance, but in this dramatization, it took on a darker hue. Her precision became arrogance. Her authority became suppression. She was no longer just a justice. She was the antagonist in a story that demanded a hero. And Crockett, standing at the podium, was being forged into that role with every interruption. The imbalance was almost unbearable to watch. One woman with the gavel, cloaked in the majesty of the court, wielding silence as a weapon. Another woman, stripped of institutional power, is fighting to hold her ground with nothing but her voice. It was David versus Goliath, but in this version, Goliath had the microphone and the authority to cut David off mid-sentence. Still, there was something in Crockett's eyes that hinted at more. A flicker of resolve, a quiet calculation. She was not merely enduring the interruptions. She was absorbing them, letting them build, letting them stack like kindling. The imbalance was real, the villainy palpable, but the story was not finished. Because while Jackson wielded her authority with precision, Crockett was preparing something else entirely. Something that would not just answer the interruptions, but transcend them. something that would turn the imbalance on its head and leave the chamber stunned. Yet beneath the surface, Crockett was preparing something no one saw coming. Long before the marble pillars of the Supreme Court loomed over her, Jasmine Crockett's story began in the humbler corners of America, where opportunity was scarce and resilience was the only currency that mattered. She was not born into privilege, nor did she inherit the kind of connections that smooth the path to power. Instead, she carved her way forward with grit, with sacrifice, and with a relentless belief that justice was not a gift handed down from above, but a right that had to be fought for. Again and again, her childhood was marked by the quiet struggles of working families. Parents who labored long hours, neighbors who leaned on one another when paychecks ran thin, and communities that knew the sting of being overlooked. Crockett absorbed those lessons early, that dignity is not measured by wealth, but by the refusal to bow in the face of hardship. She carried that truth with her into every classroom, every job, every fight she would later take on. When she first stepped into the world of law, it was not with the polished confidence of someone destined for the bench, but with the raw determination of someone who had seen injustice firsthand. She represented clients who could not afford high-priced attorneys, people whose voices were often drowned out in the noise of bureaucracy. She sat across from mothers terrified of losing their children, workers cheated out of wages, and young men facing sentences that would steal decades of their lives. Each case was more than paperwork. It was a life, a story, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. But the sacrifices were real. Long nights spent poring over case files meant missed family gatherings, birthdays celebrated with phone calls instead of presents, and friendships strained by the relentless demands of advocacy. Crockett bore those costs quietly, knowing that the work demanded it. She was not chasing prestige. She was chasing justice, and justice rarely comes without a price. Her rise into politics was not orchestrated by consultants or fueled by corporate donors. It was grassroots, built on the backs of volunteers who believed in her, on the voices of communities who saw in her someone who understood their struggles because she had lived them. She knocked on doors, shook hands in church basements, listened in barbershops and community centers. She did not speak to people. She spoke with them, and that distinction made all the difference. When she entered Congress, she carried those same neighborhoods with her. Every speech, every vote, every fiery exchange on the House floor was tethered to the people who had sent her there. She was not interested in playing the game of politics for its own sake. She was interested in bending the system, however slightly, toward fairness. And that authenticity, that refusal to conform to the polished detachment of Washington, made her both admired and feared. Her critics called her too blunt, too confrontational, too unwilling to play nice. But her supporters saw something else. A woman who refused to be silenced, who embodied the dignity of communities long ignored. She became a symbol of identity pride, of immigrant families who saw in her the validation that their voices mattered, of young women who saw in her the courage to stand tall in rooms designed to shrink them. And so, when she stood in the Supreme Court chamber, facing the interruptions of Justice Jackson, she was not just a congresswoman defending a case. She was the culmination of every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of resilience that had defined her journey. Each interruption was not merely an attack on her words. It was an echo of every time she had been told to wait her turn, to lower her voice, to accept less than she deserved. But Crockett had never accepted silence as her destiny. She had built her career on persistence, on the refusal to yield. Her calm in that chamber was not accidental. It was the product of years spent learning how to withstand storms without breaking. She knew that dignity under fire is not about avoiding conflict, but about holding your ground when conflict comes. The audience watching could feel it. They could sense that this was not a woman easily rattled, not a woman who would crumble under the weight of authority. They could see in her the embodiment of every person who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or overlooked. And in that recognition, they rooted for her. They wanted her to withstand the storm, to prove that persistence could outlast arrogance, that truth could outshine authority. Her story was not one of privilege, but of perseverance. It was not about doors opened for her, but about doors she had kicked down herself. And that story, that backstory, was the armor she carried into the chamber. It was why, even as the interruptions mounted, she stood taller, spoke clearly, and refused to let her voice be erased. Because Crockett knew something that the gavel could not silence. That the power of a voice rooted in truth is stronger than any interruption. And when the 8th interruption came, Crockett's response would flip the script. The 2nd interruption came swiftly, almost before Crockett had regained her footing from the first. She had begun to outline the historical precedent for her argument, her voice steady but deliberate. when Justice Jackson leaned forward and cut in again. The words were clipped, dismissive, as though the very foundation of Crockett's reasoning was unworthy of the court's time. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Crockett paused, inhaled, and pressed on. Her tone did not rise, her composure did not crack. But the imbalance was clear. Authority was flexing its muscle, and the chamber could feel it. By the third interruption, the tension had thickened. Crockett had just begun to connect her argument to the lived experiences of marginalized voters when Jackson's voice sliced through once more. This time, the justice's tone carried an edge of impatience, as if to say, "Enough of this." Crockett's jaw tightened. She steadied herself, adjusted her papers, and continued. The audience leaned forward, sensing the stakes. Each interruption was not just a procedural move. It was a symbolic act, a reminder of how easily power can silence truth. The fourth interruption landed like a hammer. Crockett had been building momentum, her cadence rising, her words gaining force. And then, cut off. The justice's voice rang out, authoritative and unyielding. Crockett froze for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing, her breath catching. The gallery gasped audibly this time, the sound echoing against the marble. Crockett's supporters in the room exchanged glances, their faces etched with disbelief. Yet still she pressed on. Her voice, though interrupted, carried a new weight, the weight of someone who refuses to yield. By the fifth interruption, the atmosphere was electric. Crockett's words were now punctuated by the justice's dismissals, each one sharper than the last. The rhythm of the exchange had become a duel. Authority striking, persistence parrying. Crockett's voice wavered for a moment, but only for a moment. She steadied herself, her eyes locking on the bench, her tone firm. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. People shifted in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The sixth interruption was the most dismissive yet. Crockett had been laying out a constitutional argument, her voice calm but resolute, when Jackson leaned back in her chair and cut her off with a tone that dripped with finality. It was not just an interruption. It was an attempt to end the conversation altogether. Crockett's lips pressed into a thin line. She paused, gathered herself, and continued. Her words now carried a defiance that could not be mistaken. She was not merely speaking. She was resisting. And then came the seventh interruption. By now the chamber was alive with tension. Crockett had been weaving her argument into a crescendo, her voice rising, her words gaining force. The justice's voice cut in once more, sharp, dismissive, final. The gallery erupted in whispers. Some shook their heads, others leaned forward, eyes wide. Crockett's shoulders squared. She did not falter. She did not retreat. Her voice, though interrupted again and again, carried the unmistakable tone of someone who would not be silenced. The atmosphere in the chamber was electric, charged with the clash of authority and defiance. Every interruption had raised the stakes. Every dismissal had sharpened the contrast. Crockett stood at the podium, her voice steady, her presence unbroken. She had endured 7 interruptions, each one sharper, more dismissive, more arrogant than the last, and yet she remained. The whispers in the gallery had grown into a low hum, the sound of a nation holding its breath. The justices shifted in their seats, the tension palpable. Crockett's supporters leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her, their hearts pounding. They knew, as everyone in that chamber knew, that something was coming. And then came the 8th point, the one that made history. The chamber had grown restless. 7 interruptions had already carved the air like repeated thunderclaps, each one meant to fracture the rhythm of Representative Jasmine Crockett's argument. Yet she stood unbroken, her voice steady, her presence unshaken. And then, as the murmurs swelled and the tension reached its peak, she leaned forward. Her eyes locked on the bench, her hands resting firmly on the podium. The 8th point was coming. She began not with anger, but with calm. Her voice was measured, deliberate, the kind of tone that forces a room to lean in rather than recoil. "Your Honor," she said, her words slicing through the tension. "The Constitution is not ambiguous here. It is not a suggestion. It is a promise." The chamber stilled. Even Justice Jackson, who had moments earlier wielded her authority like a blade, paused. Crockett's words carried an undeniable weight, a clarity that could not be dismissed. She continued, her cadence slow, her emphasis deliberate. Article 1, Section 4 grants Congress the power to regulate the times, places, and manner of elections. That authority is not theoretical. It is explicit. And when states attempt to suppress the vote, when they create barriers designed to silence, it is not only within Congress's power, but its duty to intervene. Her voice did not rise, but its steadiness carried more force than any shout could. She leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes never wavering. This court has long recognized that the right to vote is a preservative of all other rights. Without it, every other freedom collapses. That is not my opinion. That is the precedent of this very institution. The words hung in the air like a verdict. The gallery was silent, the kind of silence that comes not from disinterest, but from awe. Crockett pressed on, her voice unwavering. From Reynolds versus Sims to Shelby County versus Holder, this court has wrestled with the balance between state authority and federal responsibility. But history has shown us one truth. When the right to vote is threatened, when citizens are silenced, it is the federal government that must act to protect democracy itself. She paused, letting the weight of history settle over the room. The silence was deafening. Even the justices shifted uneasily, their pens stilled, their eyes fixed on her. Crockett's gaze swept the chamber, her presence commanding. We are not here to debate abstractions. We are here because real people, citizens of this nation, are being denied their voice. And if this court allows that denial to stand, it will not be neutrality. It will be complicity. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The words were bold, unflinching, and they landed with the force of truth. Crockett did not flinch. She pressed forward, her voice now carrying the rhythm of inevitability. The Constitution does not bend to convenience. It does not yield to those who fear the voices of the people. It demands that every citizen, regardless of race, wealth, or geography, be given equal access to the ballot. That is not radical. That is America. Her words cut through centuries of silence, centuries of struggle, centuries of voices drowned out by power. She was not merely speaking to the justices before her, she was speaking to history itself. The chamber seemed to shrink around her, the marble walls echoing her words back like a chorus. Justice Jackson, who had interrupted her 7 times before, sat motionless. For the first time, her authority seemed muted, her voice absent. The interruptions had ceased, replaced by a silence that spoke louder than any dismissal. Crockett had seized the moment, and the court knew it. The gallery erupted, not in noise, but in energy. Eyes widened, jaws dropped, and hands covered mouths in disbelief. The murmurs began slowly, then grew, a wave of awe that swept through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment. Clerks exchanged glances, their faces betraying the recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Crockett did not bask in the reaction. She stood firm, her voice steady, her words precise. This is not about partisanship. It is not about power. It is about principle. The right to vote is the foundation of this republic. And if we allow it to be chipped away, if we allow silence to replace speech, then we betray not only the Constitution, but the very idea of America. Her final words landed like a gavel strike. The chamber was still, the silence heavy, the moment undeniable. Crockett had not shouted, had not raged, had not yielded. She had spoken with the calm precision of truth, and in doing so, she had turned the imbalance on its head. For a long moment, no one moved. The justices sat in silence, the gallery frozen, and then slowly the murmurs began again. They were not whispers of dismissal, but of awe, of recognition, of history being made. The 8th point had landed, and it had left the court gasping. Crockett stepped back from the podium, her eyes steady, her presence unshaken. She had endured 7 interruptions, each one sharper, more dismissive than the last. But with her 8th point, she had silenced the interruptions, silenced the arrogance, silenced the doubt. The chamber would never forget it. The nation would never forget it. For in that moment, Crockett had not only defended the right to vote, she had embodied it. She had shown that persistence can outlast power, that dignity can outshine arrogance, that truth can silence even the loudest authority. The gallery buzzed with energy. The justices sat in stunned silence, and the cameras captured every second. The 8th point had been delivered, and it had changed everything. But the shockwaves didn't end in that courtroom. The silence that followed Crockett's 8th point did not stay confined within the marble walls of the Supreme Court. It spilled outward, carried by cameras, microphones, and the restless energy of a nation hungry for moments that cut through the noise. Within minutes, the clip was online. Within hours, it was everywhere. The hashtags began almost instantly. Crockett 8th point trended first. A rallying cry for those who had watched her endure 7 interruptions only to deliver a knockout blow with calm precision. Then came Shah's courtroom gasp, a digital echo of the audible reaction that had rippled through the chamber. Screens lit up across the country as millions replayed the moment, pausing, rewinding, sharing. The clip became more than evidence of a legal argument. It became a symbol, a story, a spark. Commentators rushed to dissect it. On cable news, panels replayed the footage in slow motion, analyzing Crockett's tone, her composure, the exact second when Justice Jackson's expression shifted from dominance to silence. Pundits debated whether it was a turning point in the case, but the public conversation had already moved beyond legal technicalities. For ordinary viewers, it was about something deeper. The dignity of a woman refusing to be silenced. The triumph of persistence over power. Social media was ablaze with reactions. Memes flooded timelines, Crockett's calm face juxtaposed with captions like unbothered, unbroken, unstoppable. TikTok creators layered her words over cinematic music, turning her 8th point into a rallying anthem. Twitter threads unpacked the constitutional references she had invoked, while Instagram Reels captured the stunned silence of the courtroom as if it were a scene from a blockbuster film. And then came the backlash, though not against Crockett. Justice Jackson, once admired for her sharp questioning, now found herself cast as the antagonist in the public imagination. Clips of her interruptions circulated with captions like silencing, won't stop the truth, and authority isn't always justice. Editorials questioned whether her tone had crossed from rigorous to dismissive, from judicial to domineering. The imbalance that had been palpable in the chamber was now being replayed in living rooms, classrooms, and coffee shops across the country. Politicians weighed in. Allies of Crockett praised her resilience, calling her performance a masterclass in dignity under fire. Opponents, careful not to appear dismissive of the viral moment, offered muted critiques, but their words were drowned out by the tidal wave of public admiration. Celebrities joined the chorus, actors, musicians, and athletes posted clips of the 8th point with captions like, "This is what strength looks like," and "Voices like this keep democracy alive." But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from everyday citizens. Teachers shared the clip with their students as an example of courage. Parents showed it to their children, saying, "This is why you never let anyone talk over you." Immigrant families saw in Crockett's composure a reflection of their own struggles to be heard in a system that often dismisses them. For many, it was not just a courtroom moment. It was validation, proof that persistence could pierce even the highest walls of authority. The ripple effect was undeniable. Community organizers reported a surge of interest in voter registration drives, inspired by Crockett's words about the Constitution's promise. Hashtags turned into movements, with online campaigns urging citizens to make your 8th point by speaking up in their own communities. The moment had transcended politics. It had become cultural, emotional, personal. And through it all, Crockett remained composed. She did not gloat, did not bask in the viral fame. In interviews, she spoke with the same calm precision she had shown in the chamber, reminding audiences that the fight was not about her, but about the people she represented. That humility only deepened the admiration. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She was a symbol, a reminder that dignity under fire can inspire a nation. Meanwhile, Justice Jackson's silence in the aftermath spoke volumes. She did not issue statements, did not defend her interruptions, but the absence of her voice only amplified the narrative that had taken hold. That authority had been checked, that arrogance had been humbled, that the gavel had been silenced by truth. The story dominated headlines for days, then weeks. It was replayed on late-night shows, referenced in sermons, and quoted in speeches. It became shorthand for resilience, a cultural touchstone that transcended the specifics of the case. People who had never before watched a Supreme Court hearing now knew the phrase 8th point, and they used it as a metaphor in their own lives. The shockwaves were not just political. They were personal. They reminded people that even in the most intimidating rooms, even against the most powerful voices, persistence could prevail. Crockett's moment was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced. Yet the true lesson wasn't about politics at all. When the echoes of Crockett's 8th point finally faded, what remained was not just the memory of a courtroom clash, but the unmistakable imprint of a universal truth. The interruptions, the dismissals, the imbalance of power, all of it had built to a moment that revealed something larger than the case itself. It was not about one justice and one representative. It was about the eternal struggle between dignity and arrogance, between persistence and suppression, between the silenced and those who refused to stay silent. Crockett's calm precision had reframed the entire confrontation. She had shown that dignity is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to stand tall within it. She had demonstrated that persistence is not stubbornness, but the quiet insistence that truth deserves to be heard, even when authority tries to drown it out. In her composure, in her refusal to break, she had given voice to millions who had felt the sting of being interrupted, dismissed, or overlooked. The lesson was clear. Every voice matters, no matter how many times it's interrupted. Every story deserves to be told, no matter how many times it's cut short. And every person carries within them the power to shift the balance, to turn silence into speech, to transform dismissal into defiance. Crockett's 8th point was not just a legal argument. It was a parable, a reminder that justice is not handed down from on high, but claimed again and again by those who refuse to yield. The chamber had witnessed more than a debate. It had witnessed the triumph of resilience over arrogance. Justice Jackson's interruptions, once symbols of authority, now stood as symbols of fragility. Proof that power without humility crumbles when confronted with truth. Crockett's words, by contrast, had grown stronger with each attempt to silence them, until they rang out with a clarity that could not be denied. And so the story transcended politics. It became a mirror for anyone who had ever been told to wait their turn, to lower their voice, to accept less than they deserved. It became a beacon for those who had been silenced in classrooms, in workplaces, in families, in nations. Crockett's moment was theirs too, a reminder that persistence is not futile, that dignity under fire is not weakness but strength. The moral was not complicated, but it was profound. Arrogance may interrupt, but it cannot erase. Suppression may delay, but it cannot defeat. Truth, spoken with calm conviction, carries further than any gavel strike. Crockett had shown that the measure of strength is not in how loudly one speaks, but in how firmly one stands when others try to silence them. Her story became a parable of resilience. It reminded the nation that democracy itself is built on the principle that every voice matters, that no interruption can erase the fundamental truth of equality. It reminded people that justice is not a static institution, but a living struggle, carried forward by those willing to speak even when the odds are stacked against them. And in that reminder lay inspiration. Teachers told their students, "This is why you raise your hand again, even if you're ignored the first time." Parents told their children, "This is why you keep speaking, even when others talk over you." Communities told themselves, "This is why we vote, why we march, why we persist." Crockett's 8th point had become more than a courtroom moment. It had become a moral compass. The clash between Crockett and Jackson was no longer about who held the gavel, or who stood at the podium. It was about the deeper truth that dignity will always outlast arrogance, that persistence will always outshine suppression. It was about the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to be erased, the insistence that every voice belongs. And so, as the nation replayed the clip, as the hashtags trended, as the story spread from living rooms to classrooms to pulpits, the lesson crystallized: silence is never the end. Every interruption is an opportunity to return stronger, clearer, and more unshakable. Crockett had shown that the 8th point is not just a moment in a courtroom. It is a metaphor for life itself. And that's why this story will echo far beyond the courtroom. The title told you everything you needed to know. Justice Brown Jackson interrupts Jasmine Crockett 7 times. Her 8th point makes the court gasp. And now, you've seen why. What began as a series of dismissive interruptions ended as a moment of undeniable clarity. A moment where truth silenced arrogance and dignity outshone authority. Crockett's 8th point was more than an argument. It was a declaration that no voice, once rooted in justice, can ever truly be erased. This story is not just about a courtroom. It is about every space where power tries to drown out persistence. Every moment when arrogance believes it can silence dignity. Crockett's calm defiance reminds us that interruptions may sting, but they cannot stop the truth. Her 8th point was not simply a rebuttal. It was a reminder that democracy itself depends on voices that refuse to be silenced. And so the lesson is clear. Persistence matters. Dignity matters. Truth matters. When arrogance interrupts, when authority dismisses, when power tries to erase, it is the steady, unshaken voice that endures. Crockett's moment belongs not only to her, but to everyone who has ever been told to wait their turn, to lower their voice, to accept less than they deserve. If you believe in voices that refuse to be silenced, if you believe that truth can still cut through arrogance, then this is your story too. Share it. Let others see what happens when persistence meets power and refuses to yield. Subscribe, so you don't just watch these moments. You become part of the movement that carries them forward. Because in the end, Crockett's 8th point was not just history. It was a call to all of us, and the echo of that call is only just beginning.